December 28th, 2025, a woman walks through Tehran's Grand Bazaar. She's holding 1.45 million rials in her hand, enough to buy a loaf of bread. A year ago, that same money would have paid her rent. The Iranian currency has collapsed. Inflation is running at 42%. Unemployment is crushing an entire generation. Young people see no future. And on this day, the frustration boils over. Protests erupt across Tehran. Within hours, they spread to Isfahan, to Shiraz, to Tabriz, to Mashhad. By December 30th, all 31 provinces are burning. The government responds with bullets. Revolutionary Guards open fire on crowds. Basij militias, the regime's paramilitary enforcers, shoot indiscriminately into residential neighborhoods. Hospitals overflow with the wounded. Morgues run out of space. By January 8th, estimates of the dead range from 2,000 to over 12,000. Iran International, a UK-based opposition media outlet, calls it the largest massacre in modern Iranian history. Bodies pile up faster than families can identify them. Bullet wounds, shotgun pellets, execution-style killings in the streets. The government shuts down the internet, cuts international phone lines, deploys checkpoints on every block. For 5 days, Iran goes dark. And then from Washington, a voice breaks through. Donald Trump. If Iran shoots and violently kills peaceful protesters, which is their custom, the United States of America will come to their rescue. We are locked and loaded and ready to go. Most world leaders issue statements. Trump issued a threat, and 3 days later, he proved he wasn't bluffing. On January 3rd, U.S. Special Forces launched airstrikes on Venezuela and captured Nicolás Maduro, another authoritarian oil regime, another Russian and Chinese ally. The message to Tehran was clear. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, went into hiding. Reports surfaced that senior officials were preparing escape plans, some allegedly seeking asylum in Russia. For the first time in over 40 years, the Islamic Republic looked vulnerable. But Trump's intervention isn't about saving democracy. It's about cutting off China's energy supply. And if he succeeds, he won't just topple a regime in Iran. He'll cripple the second largest economy on Earth. Let's go back to what actually happened on the ground. The protests began over economics. The Iranian rial had been in free fall for months. By late December, it hit 1.45 million to the dollar. For context, in 2015, before sanctions intensified, it was around 30,000 to the dollar. People couldn't afford food. Businesses were shutting down. The government had no answers. Iranians have lived under U.S. sanctions for over 40 years. They've endured wars, inflation, isolation, but this time felt different. Because this time, the regime had no external enemy to blame. The protests weren't organized by foreign agents or opposition groups. They were spontaneous, triggered by ordinary people who simply couldn't survive anymore. And they spread fast. Within 48 hours, demonstrations were happening in over 190 cities simultaneously. Millions of people in the streets chanting the same thing: death to the dictator. The government panicked. On December 30th, Supreme Leader Khamenei gave the order: suppress the uprising by any means necessary. The Revolutionary Guard, Iran's elite military force tasked with protecting the regime, moved into position. So did the Basij, a volunteer paramilitary force numbering in the hundreds of thousands. They didn't use tear gas or rubber bullets. They used live ammunition. Eyewitness reports describe Revolutionary Guards firing directly into crowds. Videos smuggled out before the internet blackout show bodies lying in the streets, blood pooling on pavement, families dragging the wounded into alleys. One video shows a morgue in Isfahan, with bodies stacked in rows. Another shows a young man with a bullet hole in his chest, still clutching a protest sign. Iran Human Rights, a Norway-based organization, reported that at least 3,428 protesters have been killed. Most victims were under 30. Most died from gunshot wounds. Iran International estimated that between December the 28th and January 9th, at least 12,000 people were killed. The Iranian government denied the numbers, but they also didn't deny that people had died. A government spokesperson said, "Many martyrs have fallen." Martyrs, not victims, not protesters. The regime was framing the massacre as a defense of the state. At least 52 people were executed between January 5th and January 14th, arrested during the protests, given sham trials, and hanged within days. By January 13th, international phone lines were restored. Residents of Tehran began calling foreign journalists. They described checkpoints on every block, helmeted police and militiamen carrying rifles, vehicles being stopped and searched, phones inspected for protest-related content. One resident told the BBC, "There's a checkpoint on every block. They search your car and your phone." If they find anything, you disappear. This wasn't crowd control. It was urban warfare against civilians. Iran has faced protests before. In 2009, the Green Movement brought millions into the streets after a disputed election. The regime crushed it. In 2019, fuel price hikes triggered nationwide protests. Hundreds were killed. The movement collapsed within weeks. In 2022, the death of Mahsa Amini, a young woman arrested for not wearing her hijab properly, sparked months of demonstrations. Again, the regime survived. But this time is different, because this time, Donald Trump is watching. And he's not staying quiet. From the very beginning of the protests, Trump sent a clear message. If Iran massacres its people, the US will intervene. He didn't say condemn. He didn't say sanction. He said intervene. For the protesters, that was a lifeline. It meant they weren't alone. It meant the world's most powerful military was paying attention. For the regime, it was a nightmare. Because Trump doesn't bluff. On January 3rd, just 6 days into the Iranian protests, Trump ordered airstrikes on Venezuela. The operation was surgical. Special forces surrounded the presidential palace in Caracas. Nicolás Maduro, another authoritarian leader, another oil-dependent regime, another ally of China and Russia, was captured and extradited to the United States. The Venezuelan military didn't resist. Maduro's inner circle didn't fight back. It was over in hours. And the message to Tehran was clear. You could be next. Reports began circulating that Ayatollah Khamenei had relocated to a secure facility outside Tehran. Other senior officials were allegedly exploring escape routes, some to Russia, others to Syria. Whether those reports are true or not, the psychological impact was real. Iran's leadership now understood that Trump was willing to use force, that regime change wasn't just rhetoric, that their survival was no longer guaranteed. But why is Trump doing this? On the surface, it looks like a humanitarian intervention, a democratic superpower supporting protesters fighting for freedom against a brutal dictatorship. That narrative fits nicely with American values. But Trump already said during his first term, America is not the world's policeman. In 2019, when Houthi rebels, backed by Iran, attacked Saudi Arabia's Abqaiq oil facility and knocked out half the kingdom's production, Trump didn't intervene militarily. Saudi Arabia is a U.S. ally. The attack was an act of war, and Trump did nothing. So why intervene now? Because toppling Iran's regime serves a larger strategic goal. It's not about democracy, it's about China. Iran is China's gas station. Let's be precise about the numbers. In November 2025, Iran exported 2.04 million barrels of oil per day, the highest level in years. Over 90% of that went to China. More specifically, 1.38 million barrels per day flowed to China's Shandong province, home to dozens of small independent refineries known as teapots. These aren't the massive state-owned operations in Beijing or Shanghai. They're private or semi-private facilities running on razor-thin profit margins. And they survive on one thing: cheap oil. Iranian crude sells at a discount. In 2025, it was $2 to $8 cheaper per barrel than benchmark Brent crude. In 2023, the discount was as high as $11 per barrel. That might not sound significant, but when you're refining millions of barrels, it's the difference between staying in business and shutting down. Chinese teapot refiners can't afford to pay full market price. If Iranian oil disappears, they either go bankrupt or dramatically reduce output. But the impact goes far beyond Shandong. China imports 70% of its total oil consumption. It's the world's largest crude importer. Iranian oil isn't a luxury, it's infrastructure. It powers factories in Guangdong, fuels cargo ships crossing the Pacific, keeps electricity grids running during peak industrial demand. Without it, China's manufacturing costs spike, energy prices rise, export competitiveness erodes. And in an economy already struggling with real estate collapse, local government debt, and youth unemployment, an energy crisis could be the breaking point. Trump knows this. That's why Iran isn't just another Middle Eastern flashpoint. It's a pressure valve on China's economy. On January 12, 2026, Trump made his next move. He announced a new policy. Any country doing business with Iran will face a 25% tariff on all exports to the United States. The target wasn't Iran, it was China. China exports roughly $500 billion worth of goods to the United States every year. A 25% tariff means an additional $125 billion in costs. That's approximately 1.5% of China's entire GDP wiped out. American companies won't absorb those costs. They'll shift orders to Vietnam, India, Mexico, anywhere the tariff doesn't apply. Chinese factories will lose contracts, workers will lose jobs, GDP growth will slow even further. But the real damage is strategic. China's economic model depends on two things: cheap energy, and access to the US market. Iran provides the energy. America provides the customers. Trump is threatening both at the same time. If China stops buying Iranian oil to avoid the tariff, Iran's regime collapses, removing a key geopolitical ally and destabilizing China's Middle Eastern energy security. If China continues buying Iranian oil, it gets slammed with tariffs that devastate its export economy. There's no good option. China loses either way. But Iran's importance to China goes beyond oil. It's about regional control. For decades, Iran has built a network of proxy forces across the Middle East, what Tehran calls the axis of resistance. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, Houthi rebels in Yemen, pro-Iranian militias in Iraq, what's left of Assad's forces in Syria. These groups keep the entire region unstable in ways that benefit China. The Houthis, for example, have been attacking commercial shipping in the Red Sea since late 2023. In 2019, they struck Saudi Arabia's Abqaiq oil processing facility, the largest in the world, knocking out 5.7 million barrels per day of production overnight. It was the single largest disruption to global oil supply since the 1991 Gulf War. Every Houthi missile is an insurance rate increase for shipping companies. Every attack on a tanker is a supply chain delay. Every drone strike is a cost passed on to consumers. And all of it forces the US to keep military assets tied down in the Middle East. American destroyers patrol the Red Sea. Fighter jets are based in Qatar and Bahrain. Missile defense systems protect Saudi and Emirati oil infrastructure. Resources that could be deployed to the South China Sea are stuck in the Persian Gulf. That's exactly what China wants. As long as Iran destabilizes the Middle East, America can't fully pivot to Asia. But Iran's proxy network runs on money, and that money comes from oil. Iran's oil revenues reached approximately $43 billion in fiscal year 2024, up from $40 billion the previous year. About 40% of that funds the government budget. A large portion flows to Hezbollah, the Houthis, Iraqi militias, and other allies. Cut the oil revenue, and the funding dries up. Cut the funding, and the proxies lose their operational capacity. Trump doesn't need to invade Iran. He just needs to bankrupt it. So what happens next? Right now, Iran is at a crossroads. The protests are in their third week. They've spread across the entire country. Unlike the 2022 Masa Amini protests, which faded after a few weeks, these show no signs of stopping. Why? Because the economic conditions haven't changed. Inflation is still at 42%. The currency is still collapsing. People still can't afford to live. And because Trump's threats have given protesters hope that the regime might actually fall this time, there are three possible outcomes. Scenario 1, full US military intervention. Trump follows through. Airstrikes on Revolutionary Guard facilities. Targeted assassinations of regime leadership. Support for internal opposition forces. This would be the nightmare scenario for Tehran, but it's also risky for Washington. A military operation in Iran would be far more complex than Venezuela. Iran has a large, battle-hardened military. It could retaliate by closing the Strait of Hormuz, which would spike global oil prices. It could activate Hezbollah and the Houthis to attack US allies. But if Trump decides the strategic payoff is worth the risk, he has the capability to cripple the regime. Scenario 2, negotiated transition. Khamenei steps down or transfers significant power to moderates. Iran agrees to freeze its nuclear program, scale back support for proxy groups, and open negotiations with the US. In exchange, sanctions are gradually lifted. The protests end, the regime survives, but in weakened form. This is the most likely outcome. It allows both sides to claim victory. Trump can say he forced regime change without war. Iran's moderates can say they prevented foreign invasion. China keeps access to Iranian oil, but under closer US scrutiny. Iranian oil exports continue, but at reduced volumes and under stricter monitoring. Scenario 3. Brutal suppression succeeds. The regime doubles down. The death toll climbs into the tens of thousands. International outrage grows, but no intervention comes. Eventually, exhausted and leaderless, the protests collapse. Khamenei remains in power. The Revolutionary Guard consolidates control. But even if the regime survives, the damage is done. Iran's economy is shattered. Its international isolation deepens. And China's reliance on Iranian oil becomes a major vulnerability. Right now, all three scenarios are in play. But the outcome that matters most isn't about Iran's government. It's about China's economy. Beijing is watching this unfold with growing alarm. Because Iran is more than just an oil supplier. It's a strategic buffer. As long as Iran keeps the Middle East unstable, the US has to station carrier groups in the Persian Gulf. That's fewer ships available for the South China Sea, As long as Iran funds Hezbollah and the Houthis, Israel and Saudi Arabia remain focused on regional threats instead of aligning more closely with Washington against Beijing. And as long as Iran survives as an independent actor, China has an ally that can absorb Western pressure and keep alternate energy routes open. If Iran's regime collapses, everything changes. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Israel, all U.S. partners, consolidate control over the Middle East. American forces withdraw from the Gulf and redeploy to Asia. China loses its cheap oil supplier and its regional buffer. But Beijing can't afford to openly defy Trump's tariff threat either, so China is trapped. It can try to negotiate, offer concessions on trade, technology transfers, or Taiwan policy in exchange for Trump backing off Iran. It can quietly reduce Iranian oil purchases while publicly condemning U.S. interference, hoping to avoid both the tariff and regime collapse. Or it can double down on Iran, accept the 25% tariff, and try to weather the economic storm. None of these options are good, and that's exactly what Trump wants. He's not just isolating Iran. He's forcing China to choose between its economy and its geopolitical strategy, between cheap energy and market access, between supporting an ally and surviving a trade war. Trump isn't fighting one battle. He's fighting two, and using Iran as the weapon. Step back and look at the pattern. January 3rd, Trump launches airstrikes on Venezuela and captures Maduro. December 28th, ongoing. Trump openly supports Iranian protesters and threatens military intervention. Ongoing. Trump pressures Denmark over Greenland, seeking control of rare earth resources and Arctic choke points. These aren't isolated incidents. They're part of a coordinated strategy to economically strangle China. Venezuela supplied cheap oil to China and provided a foothold in the Western Hemisphere. Now it's gone. Iran supplies 90% of its oil to China and keeps U.S. forces tied down in the Middle East. Trump is trying to take that away. Greenland holds rare earth deposits that could break China's monopoly on critical materials. Trump is working to secure them. Every move is designed to cut another lifeline to Beijing. And the timing couldn't be worse for China, because the country is already collapsing from within. The real estate sector, which accounts for roughly 30% of China's GDP, is in freefall. Evergrande, once the country's largest property developer, defaulted on over $300 billion in debt. Country Garden followed. Dozens of smaller developers have gone under. Millions of Chinese families bought apartments that will never be finished. Their life savings are locked in unfinished concrete towers. Local governments are drowning in over $9 trillion in debt. They borrowed heavily to fund infrastructure projects that generate no revenue. Now they can't pay public sector salaries, maintain basic services, or repay loans. Youth unemployment officially hit 21.3% in June 2023. Then the government stopped publishing the figure entirely. The real number is almost certainly higher. And foreign companies are leaving. Apple is shifting iPhone production to India. Samsung has moved to Vietnam. Nike, Adidas, and dozens of major manufacturers are diversifying supply chains away from China. This is the foundation Trump is attacking. An economy already cracking under the weight of debt, unemployment, and capital flight. Now add an energy shortage from losing Iranian oil. Add 25% tariffs that destroy export competitiveness. Add the loss of rare earth monopolies if Greenland opens up. Trump isn't declaring war on China. He's dismantling the infrastructure that keeps China competitive while the country is already on the edge. One supplier at a time, one resource at a time, one tariff at a time. There's one more country watching this closely. North Korea. Kim Jong-un has seen what happened in Venezuela. He's watching what's happening in Iran. Both are authoritarian regimes. Both depend on Chinese support. Both have been under U.S. sanctions for decades. And both are now facing the possibility of U.S.-backed regime change. What does that tell Kim Jong-un? That China can't protect its allies anymore. That U.S. military intervention is back on the table. That his regime could be next. North Korea has always positioned itself as the madman with a nuclear weapon. Too dangerous to attack. Too unstable to ignore. But if Trump is willing to strike Venezuela and threaten Iran, what stops him from striking Pyongyang? Kim has two options. Negotiate while he still can, offer denuclearization, open trade, regime survival in exchange for alignment with U.S. interests. Or double down on provocations, testing missiles and threatening South Korea and Japan to prove he's still dangerous enough to deter intervention. Either way, the calculus has changed, because Trump has shown that authoritarian regimes dependent on China are now fair targets, and Kim knows it. The protests in Iran aren't just about economic collapse. They're about the unraveling of China's global position. For years, China built its strategy around cheap energy from Iran, strategic buffer zones in the Middle East, and economic leverage through trade surpluses with the U.S. Now all three are under attack, while China's domestic economy is already crumbling. Trump isn't invading countries. He's collapsing their economies and letting internal pressure do the work. He's not sanctioning China directly. He's threatening its oil supply and export markets, forcing Beijing to choose between bad options. And when China is backed into a corner, history tells us what comes next. Cornered animals attack. Desperate empires go to war. China's leadership knows that if they lose access to Middle Eastern oil, if tariffs destroy their export economy, if rare earth alternatives emerge in Greenland, their entire development model collapses. And when that happens, there's one final card left to play: Taiwan. The protests in Tehran, the airstrikes in Caracas, the pressure on Greenland, they're not separate crises. They're the early tremors of the earthquake to come. China is losing its economic lifelines, one by one. And when the last one breaks, the tremor becomes a wave that will crash across East Asia, the South China Sea, and the global economy. Iran wasn't the target, it was the fuse. Economic warfare doesn't look like tanks rolling across borders. It looks like protests in Tehran, tariff threats in Washington, oil shipments rerouted to avoid sanctions. By the time the war is over, most people won't even realize it happened. Trump isn't fighting China with aircraft carriers. He's fighting with oil embargoes, rare earth monopolies, and regime change operations disguised as humanitarian intervention. If you want to see how these events reshape global power without firing a shot, subscribe to Endgame Economics, because the next crisis may not be announced with a missile launch. It might begin with a currency collapse, a tariff, or a protest. See the pattern. Stay ahead. Stay ready.